Hello, everyone, and welcome to TEP Talks Professional Series, a groundbreaking new podcast dedicated to showcasing the diverse career journey and professional accomplishments of TEP alumni, brought to you by the TEP Foundation. I am your host, Stan Silverman, URI Class of 79, Tau Omega 402. It's my privilege to speak to TEP brothers across a wide spectrum of industries, gaining insights into their fields, advice for breaking in, and a realistic look at the day-to-day work behind some of the most impactful careers in the modern economy. Personally, I found so many of the brothers with whom I spoke to have such interesting stories. I'm sure that in addition to the educational benefit that you will gain from watching and listening to these professionals, the stories that they tell are just plain fascinating. So pick one, anyone, or pick them all. I'm certain that it'll be worth your while. Thank you and happy watching. Hello, everyone. Today, I have the good fortune to be speaking with Joel Kanter. Joel is a venture capitalist. So, without further ado, here we go. Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Very nice to meet you, sir.
Nice to meet you too.
So, tell me about yourself.
Um,
Okay.
so I graduated from Tulane University, which is another answer to one of the things you wanted to know about. Where did I become and when did I become a TEP? I became a TEP in the fall of 1974, and was a political science major, graduated with honors in political science, and my aspiration was to end up in Washington, D.C. and on Capitol Hill. So I went after graduation, went back to work on a campaign in Illinois, which is where I am from originally, and he won. I had deferred law school for a year so I could, for the first time in my life, stay through November, and be paid staff and all of that kind of stuff. And I had no expectation that, there was going to be a job with him to come out of that. And so my plan was basically to drive down to Springfield once the election was over and see if anybody would offer me a job for 9 months down there. And instead, Ab called up 6 days after the election and said, "Have you ever thought, what are your plans?" I told him what I just told you. He said, "Have you ever thought about Washington?" I said, "Of course I've thought about Washington. I've worked for you every other summer since I was a freshman in high school." And just graduated with an honors degree in political science. So yes, I've thought about Washington a lot. Why are you asking? And he said, "Because I'd like you to come do my Judiciary Committee work." And this was sort of 5 years after Peter Rodino was sitting in the chair of the Judiciary Committee room, conducting the Watergate hearings, and I just couldn't think of a cooler place on the planet to get to have the chance to work. So I hopped in the car and drove to DC instead, and spent a couple of years working for him. He then became President Carter, then offered him a slot on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit. And I ended up leaving Capitol Hill for a while to do lobbying for the state attorneys general, which was a really interesting group actually to work with. I did environmental and criminal justice issues. They were obviously very tough on criminal justice. They were very environmentally protective on environmental issues, at least back then, regardless of party. And so, interestingly, it resulted in some really odd stuff. The oddest one I would tell you about is that at some point, John Ashcroft, more recently a senator from Missouri, but back then the Attorney General of Missouri, and later the governor, was the chair of our association. And I asked him if there was any chance that he would be willing to support some gun control resolutions that weren't sort of a let's throw them all away or strip people of their rights to have one, but at least had some controls over background checks and things of that ilk. And he was all in favor of having, I mean, his view was if you're going to go shoot somebody, I'm going to treat you as a criminal, but, also there is a societal benefit to not necessarily having everybody be armed all the time. And he was supportive of the resolution and helped me get it through the association. And all of a sudden, we were up on Capitol Hill lobbying for, federal gun control laws. So anyway, that was my second job. Third job was I went back onto Capitol Hill as the staff director of the House Democratic Caucus. It was working for a guy named Gillis Long, who was part of the much bigger Long family, Russell and Huey and all of those folks. He was a congressman from the far western part of Louisiana, kind of a ruralish sort of district. And he had a whole bunch of things that he wanted to do to make sort of the 1984 presidential campaign different than any of the ones that had recently preceded it. His view essentially was that Walter Mondale and John Glenn were going to be in sort of a basically a two-person race, and that would be unfortunate. He thought Glenn was too boring and Mondale was too liberal, and so he was trying to engender another candidate, getting enough votes to actually come out of nowhere and take the nomination. And so we spent about 2.5 years doing three things mostly. We wrote a book called Blueprint for America, which was the first time Democrats were ever in print in favor of free trade and balanced budgets, among a variety of other things. He thought that there might be a brokered convention in 1984, which would have been first time in 100 and something years that had happened. But nonetheless, he was fairly convinced that the votes could get split in enough different ways that might happen. If that was the case, God forbid you not be in the room when it happens, as they would say in Hamilton. But also there's almost no elected official who will choose to become a delegate by running to be a delegate, because God forbid you lose that race, right? And so we created super delegates because we needed to get Gillis in the room, and that was the only way we could come up with to do it. Back then, there were only 31 of them, and they were all members of Congress. Obviously, way more of them today, and all that kind of stuff. But that came out of his desire to sort of be there in case there was a brokered convention. And the third thing that we did was we decided at that point the League of Women Voters was the only organization that had ever sponsored presidential debate. Um, I'm not going to say that they picked their moderators poorly, but it had gotten to a point where the moderators kind of understood that they could get away with sort of saying something or asking a question once and then going back lightly a second time. But nobody had ever had the guts to basically say, Senator, you didn't answer the question, and really try to force, a bigger and broader discussion. And so we decided we were going to sponsor the House Democratic Caucus was going to sponsor the first presidential debate in 1984. We were going to do it in New Hampshire because that made sense given New Hampshire being first. And we would do it at Dartmouth because we wanted half of the program to basically be kids asking questions. And so why not do it at, the best university in New Hampshire? And the debate was going to be aired. So the primary was early February. The debate was going to be aired the weekend between the AFC and NFC championship games. So we had no competition from football or other huge sports on a Sunday afternoon. And the first 90 minutes were, as we had designed it, were going to be the seven candidates all sitting in executive chairs on stage, but in a semicircle with somebody in the middle who would moderate this discussion and ask the questions that we wanted to be as good and tough a journalist as we could find. But none of the, Tom Brokaws of the world would say yes to do that, or Walter Cronkites and such. And so we went and asked a guy who at the time was the relatively new host of a relatively new show called Nightline. And so Ted Koppel was the moderator for the first 90 minutes and did a fabulous job of asking questions and follow-ups and forcing a discussion. And then there would be a very short break. And when it came back, it would be somebody who would go wander the audience and take questions that the kids wanted to have asked or students wanted to have asked. And for that role, we chose Phil Donahue, which created quite a little ruckus with the leadership in the House of Representatives, who all basically knew Phil Donahue but he does divorces and drugs. And I was like, okay, but he came from a station in Chicago. I'm from Chicago. I've watched a lot of Phil Donahue shows. He's interviewed the mayor of Chicago. He's interviewed the governor of Illinois. He's interviewed congressmen and senators and stuff. I mean, that's not all he does. I mean, I get that that's what drives the ratings, but it's not what Phil does. What Phil does is actually listen to people's answers and come up with ways of continuing the interaction really, really well. And isn't that what we want out of this? and they finally did relent. And so we ended up, the debate went on. Um, Interesting little factual things. So what mostly happened in the debate was Glenn did not do real well. Mondale was okay. Gary Hart looked like an absolute superstar when he was an asterisk going into the debate, and he came in second in New Hampshire, coming into the actual election. And for a while, Glenn dropped out 2 weeks later. And for a while, it had become a Mondale Hart race, until we got to Super Tuesday, which was back then all of Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. There
Mhm.
were three primaries on the same day. That's what made it so incredibly super. And word on the street was that if Mondale lost two of the three, he was going to drop. We had never really given a bunch of consideration to what happened if Hart lost two of the three. But that is actually what happened. So Mondale took Alabama, Hart took Georgia, and lost Florida by less than a vote a precinct. And that's sort of how I look back on it and say that's how close Gillis came to actually pulling off all this stuff that he had dreamed about. Obviously, that's not how it went. Mondale got the nomination and lost every state but Minnesota, and the District of Columbia. But it did change certain things about how we've conducted presidential races and stuff. And so it was fun. Gillis passed away on Inauguration Day in '85, and I needed to go find something else to do. I had a couple of epiphany interviews that were sort of okay, I don't want to work in the Senate, and my other one in the House was with then freshman Congressman from Oregon, Ron Wyden, who wanted me to be his AA. And I had a wonderful interview with him and called my wife when it was over and said, okay, so like this guy is incredibly smart. And if he can stick around for 20 years, he's going to be something someday. But I'm not sure I can wait 20 years for him to get to the kind of level that Gillis already had and stuff. And so, I mean, I think I need to find something else to do. Which led us to career number two, which is that there was a magazine here in Washington called National Journal, which was easily the most read and most prestigious magazine in DC. It had been started by a native New Yorker who had been in Washington for a long time and basically had come to believe that Washington and New York just don't understand each other because Washington plays in 2-year election cycles, not quarters, and Wall Street thinks in basically black and white, and that's not how people in Washington think. And sort of, so you read all this stuff about what's going to happen with the MX missile vote or cafe standards or this, that, or the other, and the fundamental reality is, it ebbs and it flows and it shifts. And what Tony would have said is, had you gone to the building the decision would be made in and you asked the janitor, that guy would have had a 99% chance of getting it right. But all these pundits will get it wrong over and over and over again because they think like New York thinks, not like how Washington thinks. And they didn't come from here. And so he wanted to create, this was back when commissions were still fixed, when many of the Fortune 500 companies were still running a pension fund from inside the treasurer's office. It doesn't mean that they weren't getting advice from anybody, but you could probably have used some more in your portfolio management. And Tony's idea was that we should create an advisory service in which we would go out and talk to friends of National Journal who were frequent contributors to the stories or other panels and conferences, who understood their little industry really, really well, and make them an advisory council. And we would pay them, if they got on the phone with one of our clients, they would pay them $400 an hour. We would keep 200, they would keep 200. I mean, you do have to turn the clock back to 1984 or 5 pricing, um, but that was a lot of money back then. And so my job for about 18 months was basically to sort of create this product, which essentially became part newsletter, part conference, and part access to this advisory council. And then go around and try to get people treasurers of Fortune 500 companies to meet with me and hopefully sign up for the service. A year after we started, we had 35 Fortune 500 companies that had signed up. By the time we sold the company, which was about 9 months later, we had close to 50 of the Fortune 500. So 10% is not that bad for 18 months or something like that.
Sure.
And it actually seemed to be working where we were at. Sometimes we're providing some really good advice, about what you should own more of or less of, depending on, where you sort of want to come out on this subject. But we can give you the answer that, about how Congress is going to end up acting on this or not acting on it. Um, and Tony got an offer from the largest consulting firm in town to buy him out for a number that made absolutely no economic sense, even if you assumed that our income statement was accurate. The part that was inaccurate about our income statement was that, like, the newsletters fundamentally mostly got written by the 47 reporters who stood outside my office and also worked for Tony, just in a different entity. They worked for
Mhm.
National Journal magazine. I worked for something called the Investors Washington Service. But, we all worked for Tony. So of course they're going to do whatever I or Tony asked them to do to help. Same thing with the conferences. If we needed a speaker on such and such, we might go outside and get an actual outside speaker. But we also had 47 reporters who were really expert on what they did. And, so I mean, and none of that obviously showed up on the income statement. I mean, the 47 reporters worked for National Journal, and they were on National Journal's income statement. You couldn't replicate this service without spending some money. And I think the people who bought it understood that, but nonetheless, it was still a number that just didn't make any sense. And so, there was no basis for me to go try to argue, no, Tony, you should wait till we have 100 clients. And so he sold it. And so I'm out of a job and trying to figure out what to do. And that leads me to the real answer to your real question, which is, so that was about the time chronologically that Reagan was commercializing various of the Department of Defense technologies, that things like the internet came from, where that was really a Defense Department technology, but all of a sudden we're going to find commercial uses for it. Same thing with some of the space stuff that, really does date back to people thinking about rockets and things that would carry smaller loads and all of that kind of stuff back in the late 80s, early 90s. We may not have built those for a while, but people began actually thinking about it and it not being just well, the only people who can do that is NASA. And so Northern Virginia sort of became the home of all of that stuff for, arguably for forever, but space has probably moved the most out of Northern Virginia, but the internet certainly has not.
Right.
And certainly during the dot-com era, I mean, my God, Northern Virginia was like you could find a new business on every corner every morning. And so I called a venture firm in Chicago that I had a relationship with, or at least knew some people at, and basically said, don't really know how far you're willing to stray, but this is what I think I've kind of learned. Washington, until all of this started, was a government and real estate town. I mean, there were the people who were here because they were working for the government, and there were the people who were selling or doing something and making more money. And those people were mostly invested in real estate and stuff. And there isn't anybody here who does venture. And yet, Northern Virginia is exploding with venture. I'm happy to go look for stuff for you. And if you decide to invest, I would ask that you make me your board designee and let's see how it all works. And so 6 months later, we had invested in six companies, sort of from DC down to kind of North Carolina and west to Georgia. And, they seem to be pretty happy with all of that. And their president decided to leave the company. We were doing this as an SBIC, not as a fund. So we had an entity that would continue going forever. You
Wait,
just
SBIC means?
A small business investment company, which means that you, based on your capital base, are allowed to borrow. So for every dollar of capital you have, you are allowed to borrow about seven from the SBA. Back then, their interest rates were 7 or 8% at a time that nationally interest rates were 15 or 16%. And so, it was a heck of an arbitrage on interest to go borrow it as opposed to trying to raise it in equity or whatever. And when I first got involved with them, they probably had $30 million out to the SBA. By the time I get to the end of this story, we had 170 million out to the SBA when the company got acquired. Um, we had 36 shareholders, four of whom were sort of very wealthy families, like the Simons of Simon Properties and the Goodsons of Goodson Todman Productions and the Pritzkers and folks like that. And the other 30 were all pretty high net worth individuals, but not, nearly as much of a I don't really care whether this ever turns out or not sort of people. Um, and I would say that the four that were the really wealthy families, as time went on, basically had an attitude that was like, we think what you're doing is really cool. We think the startups are really interesting, and we love, hearing about and watching these things grow. The stock certificates are in the vault. We'll give them to grandchildren someday. It's not like we need the money. And we're fine. And then we had the other 30 who began to get very chirpy about well, if you were a fund, you'd be 10 years old and trying to figure out how you were moving on to fund two by now. And we were like, but
Mhm.
we're not a fund. And we've taken all this money from the SBA. And the reality is we are not allowed to send you a dime until all of that money is repaid. So we can try to do that if you all wanted, but that means selling anything that we can sell whenever we can sell it. And you're cutting off your upside to a significant extent. And we just had that argument for about 6 or 7 years until sort of the earliest 90s, 93, 94, when I decided that the real answer to this conundrum was to take the company public and let people have freedom of choice. And so we did that. We had another 6 or 7 years of a not unbelievably happy, but not unbelievably unhappy public life. I think the problem that we had as a public company on the one hand was that every once, you would see some of our portfolio companies go public, and that would sort of cause the stock to go up. You would see some of them get big enough that people were reading about them and things, and so the stock would go up. And then you would sort of get back into an analyst trying to actually figure it out. And the reality is you'll never figure it out because I can't give you that information. The company has no reason to give you the information. And so the example I used to always use as we would have this discussion with analysts is, so one of the biggest things in the portfolio that is going to be a winner, I just can't give you the financials because I'm on the board and that's all confidential information in a private company. But we invested in Sonicare toothbrushes when it was a drawing on a piece of paper, and the only other alternative you had was a manual toothbrush. Now, I can assure you that, we're now 6 or 7 years into this. Revenue is actually pretty substantial. The company is making money. And they are growing in relative leaps and bounds. But I can't give you any of the details of all of that because the company's not going to want that out in the market. And I don't have the ability to break the confidentiality for you. So you can go ask other people questions and try to come up with what you want. But I can also tell you, our investment was at 50 cents a share. Company has never raised another dime. And so I mean, you saw it on the cover of Sharper Image last Christmas. You, you got to kind of believe that company is worth considerably more than it was when, and I mean, ultimately they got to a number, which was that Phillips, 5 or 6 or 7 years after that bought us out for $500 million. But I can't tell you that in the meantime. So our frustration in being a public company was an analyst doesn't want to do this without all the information. I can't give you all the information. And so we always traded at a small discount to book and a much larger discount to what I would have viewed as true value. Had you really put a price tag on what everything was worth on some given day. Um, on the other hand, that was not as bad as some people who similarly had basically private assets that was their balance sheet and also could never get full book value to be recognized. So anyway, we spent six years as a not unhappy but not incredibly happy public company, always thinking that we should be trading at a somewhat better valuation. But the stock price kept moving up, and then in 1999 we uh, got approached by a small but very popular and hot at the time e-commerce internet investment banking firm who wanted to merge with us and sort of run this as a two-platform company, healthcare and the internet e-commerce kind of stuff. Um, and so we closed the deal. The day we announced the deal, I think we were trading at 14. We closed at 37. We used to trade about 100,000 shares a day. That day we traded 22 million. I mean, it was just sort of one of these 1999 things that you can never sort of look back on and figure out how it happened in the first place. By the time the stock topped out in early 2001, we were at 130 something and trading at a $2.5 billion market cap. I actually had some of the original shareholders who had never sold a share and would call them up and basically say, "You do realize there is like no set of arithmetic on the planet that says that we're worth $2.5 billion other than the little number in the Wall Street Journal. And you should really go sell some." Um, we had three or four shareholders from the original 34 that never actually did. And I mean, I feel bad about that, but it's not like we didn't have these conversations. My family sold all the way up and all the way down, and I mean, took an awful lot of money off the table. And so then I was, and more or less the balance of the answer to your question is that that was my last career. And because we had made a flip from a fairly diverse set of kinds of investments to them all being in healthcare in the latter years of the 90s, what we have ended up doing for the last 25 years has basically been just we invest as a family office. We do a lot of venture, and it's all in healthcare. We have probably done 450 healthcare companies over the last 40-ish years. Of those, 120 have gone public, 33 made the Inc. 500 list. There are four that crossed the $1 billion mark in sales, which statistically I understand you to have a 0.17 zeros and a one chance of doing once. Um, pretty good outcomes for stuff. And mostly I feel like, from my perspective, given that my start in all of this was public policy, um, I think about like what would happen if what I was really doing was software companies or, pick a subject like that. And I'm not trying to diss software companies. I'm just trying to sort of say, to me, it makes a difference when I can tell you that, we backed the company that took you out of bed and gave you a multi-channel infusion pump as a cancer patient and let you walk around the hospital holding a pole with three or four bags on it instead of getting your medication one drug at a time because that was all we were capable of giving you back in the early 1980s. Then we also backed the company that built the first elastomeric pump, and now you can just walk around with something basically attached to your tummy, and it will be infusing you and not visible to anybody and all of that. And isn't all those things? I mean, do they make patients weller and is it nicer and all of that? We did things like, I mean, I can bore you with a lot of stuff, but I mean, we backed the first company to make orthopedic products out of titanium instead of steel. So rather than your knee being something that's going to weigh down your whole leg because it's made out of a very heavy metal, now it's pretty light, doesn't put as much wear and tear on your muscles and skeletal system. We built the first assisted living facility in the country. We built the first long-term care hospital in the country. We built the first Alzheimer's units in the country. And we've done a lot of stuff where I can at least look back and say, I mean, I think we have contributed to the greater wellness of America and some other parts of the world. And that takes me like full circle on the political side of at least I feel like we did something worthwhile.
Gives you something to be proud of.
Yeah.
What does a political administrative assistant make?
I have no idea what they make today. I would guess high five digits.
So less
Yeah,
than 100,000.
less than 100, but somewhere in sort of the 70 to 90-ish kind of range.
Okay. 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 I know
But
I'm
that's
flipping.
also a total guess. I mean, I
Okay.
haven't seen Congress offices.
I realize that I'm flipping
Yeah,
around.
no, you flip all you want.
So so the odds of success being what they are, to be a venture capitalist, we're talking about needing probably $1 billion and 5 to 10 years of patience.
Um, so again, it depends on what field you're talking about. I mean, writing a piece of software will cost you a lot less than $1 billion, as will a whole bunch of other things. In healthcare, The answer is in part, are we talking about a services business? Because if I open up a tattoo removal clinic, which is a medical procedure, because
Hmm.
that must be done by a dermatologist or somebody similar to that. Um, I mean, you're going to need to open an office. It's going to cost you rent, and you're going to need some nurses and this, that, and the other. And you're going to need a bunch of equipment that you can lease, but will be nonetheless relatively expensive. But, the first patient that walks in to get their tattoo removed, I mean, they're going to write you a check. And now you have some cash that can help offset other things. Whereas, if we are inventing the elastomeric pump, I mean, the reality is we have some amount of time that we're just doing the research and trying to build a prototype that the FDA says, yes, there is a path for you to get approved. And then we've got several years of trying to get approved. And then you got to go do it in every other country in the world that you want to be selling in, because the reality is the EU doesn't recognize the FDA, and somebody in Africa will not recognize either the EU or the FDA, and so on and so on and so on. And Japan's FDA is harder than our FDA, and stuff like that. And so the answer, I think, is, the really critical thing is to get to the point where you're allowed to sell something. I mean, the market will tell you something after that. And hopefully you in fact will start selling more and more of it, and less of the money that you need to pay payroll every month is coming from non-sales sources.
Well, I
Um,
guess my question is, some of those businesses will be successful and some of them will not. So
yes.
therefore, you need to spread your risk by investing in 10 or 100 different businesses.
If you
That's why
were, yes,
the number I came up with.
somewhere in between that. So if you were a fund, you would probably target having about 30. And depending on the size of the fund, there might be, two people working on it, or there might be 15 people working on it. I mean, if you actually raised $1 billion fund, obviously you're going to do the same 30 companies. You're just going to do bigger numbers.
Okay.
Whereas in the world that I live in, if I think the most that we ever invested in a single company was probably something in the maybe five-ish range. And that was multiple rounds of financing, but we needed to participate in every one of them, because otherwise somebody's going to ask, well, why didn't they? They were your founding investor. How come they said no?
Mhm.
And that'd be a tough question to answer. I'm also usually sitting on the board, which also makes it tougher to sort of not show up for the financing. So, but you're right. It's multiple rounds, and I think what you're mostly trying to do every time you need to go back out to the market is, on the one hand, you clearly want to have progress that you can show that says we are closer to the ultimate goal, which is that somebody says, yes, this should go on the market, and then somebody actually buys it,
Mhm.
and is using it somewhere. And to the extent that you can then further prove that you're getting a benefit out of it for the person or society or whatever, even better. If you have those things happening, it will be easier to find investors who might have been skittish when this was a drawing on a piece of paper, but aren't skittish when we begin to actually have clinical results. And maybe they can write a bigger check than they could have or would have back when it was the drawing on a piece of paper. So you're constantly trying to expand the shareholder base. In an ideal world, which I don't think we live in anymore, but we used to. I mean, back when NASDAQ still had a small cap exchange and you could list in London or Israel if you wanted to. The other outlet used to be get the company to some level of progress and take it public, because then you're sort of at a place where now you're looking for 20 or $30 million. It's easier there than it is to cobble together three or four or five or six private investors, and your shareholders will have freedom of choice. So you won't have as many of them sort of knocking on your door with the when are we going to be liquid question, which is, not a happy question to get from your shareholders.
What was the worst investment you ever made?
Oh, um, that's a really good question. I Worst comes in a couple of different categories. So one category, and I'll give you real example, I mean, I'll give you the real example, is you both put a lot of money into it. You really made a bet on the management team that was wrong. And ultimately, it actually turned out that the product was also wrong. And so on all counts, you're losing money. And my biggest example of that would have been before we became healthcare only. We did spend a few years being somewhat eclectic. There was a company here in DC that several people had started who had unbelievable postal experience and understood sort of what the post office does well and what the post office does not do well, and had a whole plan for how we were going to modernize and technologize the delivery of mail, so that there were at least certain things that if they were going to business would get to you considerably faster because we will print that where you want it delivered. It will be handed to the USPS, basically within time for it to make it into people's bags tomorrow. And so rather than it being 3 days or 5 days or 7 days for it to get to them, you would have effectively what will not look like a telegram, but will be with almost telegram kind of speed. And at some point in our process, we had signed a bunch of people up. We were generating revenue. And I don't remember what caused our CEO to decide that he needed to leave. I think it was a health issue, but he left. And the number 2 or 3 person took over. It was a guy who had been general counsel. And he turned out to be a bit slimy and tough. And at some point, the shareholders had a bit of a rebellion and the board, and we all decided we were going to fire him and put somebody else in his place. And that was the condition to some extent of like the next financing coming in to try to keep this alive for a little bit longer. Um, and he actually took us all hostage. Well, I'm going to overstate this, but he took us all hostage. We were all sitting in a conference room. He basically said, if you walk out the door, I'm going to lock it behind you. And we were like, we're not leaving you in here by yourself with all the code. I mean, you are. And so we called the DC police, and for about 36 hours, we were having a standoff between the conference room and him in his office, and trying to make sure that we had the computers protected and that we weren't going to lose the company because he was going to walk off with all the code and software. Ultimately, none of that mattered because we got him out. But our clients were just tormented by the news articles about what had happened in this building the other night and stuff. And so, company went under, and I mean, we lost a fair bit of money, and probably in a situation where it didn't need to happen. Um, I
Did
think
you ever miss the, I'm sorry,
that's all right. Go ahead.
did you ever miss the boat and say, my gosh, why didn't I see the genius of that? I should have
Um,
invested.
I'm sure it's happened. I can't think offhand of what it was. I think the ones that bother me more are where we didn't fail, or we were successful, but it just was never the magnitude that it actually should have been looking backwards. And so, as an example, I'm going to go back to the little story I was telling you a second ago, except that it's real. So we actually started a company. I mean, we were not the first person in the planet to create a tattoo removal clinic. There are, I mean, in almost any city, you'll find them on various corners. You will usually find them only in ones on various corners. And it will have some dermatologist who's attached to it, maybe full-time, maybe not full-time. And then they've got their other less than doctor kind of nursing people who will do a lot of the stuff. Um, and we decided that this could all be much more professionalized, that if we could focus on geographic concentration and in places where you knew a lot of people already had tattoos. So it was, likely that people would continue to and maybe would find their way to something that had a cute and clever name, that, it would be better than sort of the onesies everywhere. And so we started in Los Angeles. In part, we had some fabulous help from a guy named Will Kirby, who was a dermatologist and had a clinic of his own. um, but also had been on Big Brother and was a very popular national person at the time that we got into discussions with Will about whether he would become part of a company that we would, all try to go work on together. And we created a company called Dr. Tadoff. We became the first multi-state, and I mean, I'm not going to tell you that there was nobody else who had more than one clinic, so I'm not going to say that we were the first multi-clinic, but we had, 8 locations in LA. We ended up having about that many up in San Francisco. We opened in Vegas. We opened in Texas. We opened in Georgia. We opened, I mean, we had sort of begun to branch out to 6 or 7 different states, and we had a lot of clinics, and people just loved the name and got lots of press. And Will got us lots of press. Will then ended up going on Big Brother again, and winning it a second time, and so like a champions thing, and so we had a lot of notoriety. And I mean, at the end of the day, we had opened a lot of clinics, and we were, sort of cash flow break even, but we had never really gotten to the point where all of them were running as efficiently enough to be making money that could then fund the thing that was coming next. And at some point, it just got to this stage where we needed some not huge amount of money, but it wasn't like $10. And in order to get that from people, what was coming back was basically because you haven't shown a profitable year yet. And we get that you're opening more stores, but nonetheless, you haven't shown a profitable year yet. I mean, we kind of think you're operating fairly inefficiently, and no, we're not willing to write the check at that valuation. And mostly it just resulted in the company being sold for way less than I think probably should have. Um, I mean, that would fall into that category. We had a second one that I'll bore you with real quickly, which is so veterinary centers are usually one of two things. It is either sort of your veterinarian who is taking care of your dog, cat, whatever. Um, and if something more serious happens, they are not licensed to do things surgically. They're licensed to help you with sort of little procedures or drugs or whatever, and diagnosis and whatever. If you really need to get operated on or something, not you, but the pet, um, it needs to go to a hospital. In human doctor terms, if that happened, the doctor that you went to see who said, yes, you need surgery, I'm going to refer you to this surgeon. That surgeon is morally and ethically obligated when they are done with your surgery to refer you back to where you came from. So, in other words, the person making the referral will never lose their patient over doing the right thing and sending you to somebody who is more professional
Right.
or more.
More
Um,
trained.
in animal care, that it does not exist as a concept.
Oh,
And so we had this problem of unless all of our clinics were both hospitals and clinics, when we had people send the pets to like a independent hospital, we would never see the pets again. And that was not good. And so it's sort of same deal. We got it up and running. We were doing some other things that were sort of less. I mean, we did some things that were related to the doctors and the patient care. Like this is going to sound like old stuff now, but back in the early 2000s, this was still kind of leading edge kind of stuff. We put a lab on everybody's desk. So, you didn't have to ship the specimen out to some hospital over there who 5 or 6 or 7 days later will get around to telling you what they found. I mean, we're going to put something on your desk that you'll have this information for the person waiting in the waiting room, in an hour or two. I mean, it's not going to take you, I mean, at worst, it's going to be overnight, but you're not going to be waiting for forever to find out what your little dog is dying over. And we tried to make the lounges more comfortable, and sort of, I mean, we found that veterinarians don't get paid a whole lot. And so by definition, they don't have a ton of money to spend on how comfortable are the chairs that you're going to be sitting in for the 4 hours. Did I put internet in the lobby? Did I, things of that ilk? We changed like all of that. And I mean, we became very, very popular. Company was called Pet Doctors, DRX. and stuff, but it still was. We reached this point where we were the third largest veterinary company in the country. We were doing about 150 million in revenue, and the climb to get much bigger than that was really getting kind of steep. And the one that's at the top is a company called Veterinary Centers of America, which is not only the largest veterinary clinic company in the country, but it's the largest lab in the country. And they had, by that time gotten sort of tired of seeing us show up taking their patients and taking better care of their animals and blah, 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 blah. And we had gone public. I don't think our public price was necessarily as fair as it maybe could have been. It wasn't horrible at all relative to what we had invested in, but nonetheless,
Mhm.
I mean, we were a 130, $40 million company at that point. And VCA showed up with an offer, and it just was like too hard to say no. I mean, I actually think we could have. I mean, my view of it is, had we had time, had we not been pushed by the public shareholders, had we, I mean, in fairness, the other thing was we got pushed a little bit by a couple of our institutional shareholders who were big venture funds that came in sort of at a later stage, but they wrote $20 million checks, but they also had this fund that was running out of time. And when your 10 years is up, your 10 years is kind of up. I mean, your limited partners are going to start getting very pissy about you not figuring out exit strategies and
Mhm.
stuff. And this was one of those situations where, we never came to a come to Jesus meeting with the two groups that were involved, but had we, because I had done one other thing with them where this did happen, had we ever come to like actual standoff about it, I mean, I'm pretty sure what they basically would have said to us is, look, we own, X% of your company in the aggregate. We have an outlet, which is we can dump it on the public market. Your stock price probably craters by 75%. You'll get back to this price someday, but not next week someday. And, I mean, if that's really the climb you want to have to make, that's fine. Otherwise, you've got a great offer from VCA and you should take it because sorry that we're cutting this off or we're cutting this off, but you knew that we were a fund when you took our $20 million, 4 years ago.
If you'd had the $20 million laying around, you could have said,
Yes,
"Here,
of
go
course,
away."
right. But that doesn't, it doesn't happen now. Yeah. My other example of that, which actually involved these same two firms, which who I'm going to remain, I'm going to have to remain nameless because they're both still good friends. Um, the orthopedic company that started making things out of titanium, we did sort of the same thing. We got ourselves up privately to about 10 million in revenue. We merged the company with a SPAC that had $25 million in it. And that sort of launched us into a whole different, I mean, it launched us into the public world, but it also launched us into a different ability to hire sales folks and expand into regions that we weren't in. We did a secondary, I don't remember through who, but for 20 or $30 million, which took our sales force up from 30 to 100. And all of a sudden, we're doing, I don't know, 150, $200 million in revenue and stuff. And I get a call from the two institutional guys who basically said, we need to have a meeting. CEO should be there. You should be there. We got to chat. And I was like, well, shit, that doesn't sound good. And so we end up having the meeting, and they basically said, so here's the situation. One of us is in year 9 of our fund life. The other one of us is in year 10. I'm not going to tell you that we can't get an extension, but it's not going to be a long one if we got one. Each of us can probably get a year, maybe 2, but this is not like we can keep going down this path for very long either. At some point, we need to have liquidity and, but we own 22% of your company between us. And so, we don't think you really want to have 22% of your company dropped on the open market. So that choice number one is we hire an investment banker. Choice number two is we start dumping your stock and trying to solve our problem, because our problem is that we need to raise fund 5 or 6 or whatever comes next. And
Mhm.
that's more important than what happens to this. And so we chose the investment banker route. At the time that I mean, that'll took a while. I mean, it was probably 18 months before we actually had firm offers from potential acquirers. Um, and so it's now 18 months later, and we have an offer for $450 million for a company that's doing 180 or something right that second in revenue. Um, and so, I mean, it seems like a pretty generous offer. It means that we're going to get, something like $27 a share when my basis is like 50 cents. Not total, but a share. And
Mhm.
no, I mean, it's going to be a huge win, except we're doing so well. And if we just had another couple of years, I mean, what number could it be? So they ended up getting the best offer from Blackstone as opposed to a competitor in the orthopedic business. Um, I'm sorry, 450 is not the right number. Blackstone offered us $895 million. So
Wow.
something like 6 times revenue. It was I mean, just a huge win. And and I, but there were those of us who were sort of sad at that moment anyway, because we had seen like how well we had done over these 3 years that we were able to start building out the sales force. We were in new countries. We were selling stuff in Mexico and, in Europe. And I mean, it seemed like the world was our oyster. And 4 years later, so anyway, we closed. Company's gone. Don't hear anything about it for a while because, of course, if you're owned by Blackstone, I mean, unless you're a Blackstone limited partner, you're not going to hear anything from anybody. 4 years
Mhm.
later, Blackstone resells it for $4.5 billion. And I mean, they did acquire a couple things. Nothing that I would say explains the gap between 895 and 4.5. And it just, when I saw the announcement, I was just like, and that's why I didn't want to have to hire the investment banker.
Did you ever have, were you ever introduced to a fantastic invention, but the inventor, you said, you don't, I don't want you, but I like your product.
That happens a lot. And the biggest question then becomes, without getting insulted about it, because everybody's got strengths and weaknesses. And so, I mean, I think when it happens the most often, it's because you have a scientist who wants to be a CEO.
Hmm.
And and they are as intrigued with sort of the next little thing that we can do that can tweak this or do that or new compound of such and such. And so, on the one hand, they're really brilliant at running a lab.
Right.
Converting to something commercial and getting it through the FDA and then taking it to market, you really kind of need to stop concentrating on plan B, C, and D. If plan A is something you really want to have succeed in the market, or you better build an infrastructure around plan A and just house it in this bigger thing that will have more products someday. I mean, that's not, um, there are interesting ways to deal with that. I mean, I would tell you, for example, in the Clarisonic example, when we sold to Philips, we only sold them the technology for dental. The management team went off for a few years and played golf and swam and whatever you do for 3 years when you've gotten a big check and you're not working. And then they got back together and they started to give some thought to like, well, what are we going to do for the second run? And so what they came up with was that women who wear makeup have no idea how many layers of dermis that really is getting into. But it's like 11 or 12 layers of your skin deep. And there's no way that your hands and a washcloth and soap are going to get that out of your skin. And so our thesis was that if we took what is basically a Sonicare toothbrush and made it a larger brush so that it could be on your cheeks and your back and your whatever, that we could accomplish that with your skin and people would have tighter skin, it would look younger, and women hopefully would go, gaga over this. And so we started a company called Clarisonic that was sort of take two of the technology. And it was I mean, I could show it to you, but it's all the way on the other side of the room. But it, you know, it was a little device that you just sort of did this for a while. And so we again got to, we became the absolute hit in the early 2010s of the entire sort of music industry, film industry, television crowd. We had every actress on the planet that just would rave about their Clarisonics. Um, and, and so it, I mean, began to blossom quite quickly, and we were doing, I don't know, 150 or so in revenue inside of 5 years. And L'Oreal shows up and offers us, I'm not sure I remember the number exactly, 350, 375, 395. I don't know. I'm a pretty big number,
Hmm.
especially since there had only been one round of financing. And, you know, this is going to a very small number of shareholders and blah, 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 blah. And, um, and so there were a few of them that were asked to stay on as consultants, but basically L'Oreal is just taking control over this. We thought this was going to be a gargantuan win because we had figured out how to sell in the US and Canada, and a couple of countries in Europe, UK in particular. But we were really struggling in Europe. We couldn't, I mean, we weren't cracking the code on how you really do this. And L'Oreal obviously could crack the code on anything in Europe.
Sure.
And so wouldn't this just be, you know, a genius thing for everybody? And as best as we could sell, they started by just doing the things you should do, which is just trying to figure out how you get into more sales outlets and stuff that we weren't able to succeed in doing. And while things seem to be growing some, it a couple years into their acquisition, all of a sudden we're getting various reports from different countries around the globe that the thing has spontaneously started on fire. And we're like, okay, well, that's really interesting because there's never been a Sonicare that has ever just become
It's the
combustible.
it's the current problem, right?
I don't know that we ever figured it out because they were running the company by then. But what they explained to us when we sort of got really irate about it, was that they had replaced several of our parts with something that was cheaper.
Oh.
And so now it was kind of okay, well, you know, who can make a comment about that other than if you change the parts? I mean, for 6 years, you know, there's never a Clarisonic that had ever caught on fire. There's never a Sonic
Hmm.
that caught on fire either. And, you know, you guys own it for less than 18 months and you've already had six of them. I mean, something's wrong here.
Right.
And, you know, then the other part that's like a L'Oreal thing as opposed to, you know, how you would think people would react in any other situation. Their reaction to all of this was, oh, this is just too much trouble. We can't afford to have that kind of trouble hanging over us. The only real answer here is just shut the company down. And that's what they did. I mean, it was just like, I mean, I went and like stole as many out of our inventory as I could because I mean, I knew that like I mean, all of my kids were using them. I mean, all of their friends were using them. It was just like, I mean, what are we going to do when the last Clarisonic, you know, dies and nobody has a way of getting another one? So unfortunately, they don't do very well in boxes in a storeroom down in the basement. Um, because
So
they,
did you ever take up the so going back to the scientist who just won't stop perfecting and tinkering, or the other guy, and you just say, you're just all over the map, you're ADHD. Here's a check. How much do you want? I'll write a check, go away. Give me all your paperwork, give me all your
No,
patents.
because that really won't actually solve the problem. Because you're going to need somebody to interpret that paperwork and stuff. What you really, I mean, I think what we really are trying to get to in that circumstance is for you to agree that you're going to be on the board. Obviously, you were the founder. You know, you will always have an almost emeritus position because you were the founder. But you need to have somebody come in here and be able to kind of run engineering and run the science and be understanding how we're getting through regulatory and into a sales mode in something less than a century. because it's not going to work if you're flitting from project to project on a daily basis. So your engineers are also flitting from project to project. And the thing that I would hope takes 3 months is going to end up taking 3 years. And none of the people that you're really going to be trying to raise money from are going to give you that kind of time frame. And so, I mean, the last thing I really want is for the person I back to end up getting fired. But, if you can't really understand what needs to happen for you to succeed, then we're going to have not nice conversations and you can be my friend, but I'm not going to go out and raise money for you.
So you've had to do that?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
We're in the middle of one right now that I don't know how it's going to come out, but I mean, absolutely everybody that's met this guy believes he's a genius, but he just can't keep his hands off of the four other things that are supposed to follow the first product. And, really the business is going to exist on the basis of the first product or your ability to continue to raise money the way you've been raising it, for forever. And I actually don't know how old he is, but I'm guessing not quite my age, which is 70, he's got enough gray hair that he's not 50 anymore either. And so, it's kind of like how long you've been doing this for 10 or 15 years already, and you've come up with some very cool stuff. But if you don't get this into something that's like going to go to market, it's all going to sit in a garage someday. I mean, what's your wife going to do with this stuff?
Yeah. Okay. So now you joined TEP. Um, what brought you into TEP?
Total randomness. So I, showed up like all freshmen show up, at Tulane, not knowing a single person. One of the first people I met, I don't really remember how, was a guy named Keith Bernhard who was from Long Island. And we became very quick and close friends. Part of it was that my roommate was both not a freshman and was kind of a pissy pants. And so, I mean, I didn't like going back to my dorm room all that much, or at least not very early. And so, it was easy to go do things with Keith.
Hmm.
And Tulane, then and now, do rush sort of when you show up at campus, at the end of August. And so more or less my first 2 weeks at school were, I mean, on the one hand, indoctrination into classes, but also were like this at night, you had invitations to like a gazillion different parties and
Hmm.
people were always serving because it's New Orleans and the drinking age is 6. And so we were just like going from house to house, basically. He was very Catholic. I obviously wasn't. But there were, I don't know, and we were just sort of trying to sample what everybody was doing. And we both discovered fairly early on in this process that we both understood how to play cards really well. And so if you could manage to get yourself into one of these things on a casino night, you could probably walk out with money and prizes that were, that other people would have been too drunk to figure out that they should be paying more attention to.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, we had a really lovely night at the Tep House on casino night. I think we might have been there once before we went to casino night. But in any event, that one turned out to be, I guess, memorable to the brothers and memorable for us, because we got a call, or however we were communicating back then, um, the next day with can you stop by and have a chat with everybody? And so we did that, which involved like a half a dozen of the older brothers and whatever. And at the end of the discussion, they basically said, I mean, have you given any thought to whether you would want to join? And we were like, well, no, because nobody's really asked. And all of this really, I mean, our best night here yesterday was last night. It's not exactly been a long time and, whatever. But sort of why are you asking? And he said, because we'd like to extend you an invitation. And so Keith and I walked out of the house and basically said, would we act? I mean, we started this as a joke. I mean, neither one of us had any intention of joining a fraternity. And so I mean, kind of looked at each other with would you be interested? And, we both sort of said, if the other one is interested, we'd be interested. And that then led to okay, but I don't have this kind of money. And Keith was like, well, I don't have that kind of money either. I mean, I assume both of us need to ask our parents. So, that could kill it. But,
Hmm.
I mean, the next question just becomes are we both willing to go ask our parents? And so we decided before that night was over that the answer was yes. And I think I called mine like the next day, and he was right around the same time frame. And much to our surprise, because I think both of us expected the answer to be no, we both got yeses. And so all of a sudden we were in a pledge class together and remained we were very close friends for all of freshman year. Keith, for what I am assuming are financial reasons on his parents' side, did not come back to Tulane for sophomore year. Went to something more local up in New York somewhere. Um, that part was always a bummer, but I mean, at that point, A, I was in TEP. B, because this was pretty rare back then. I don't know if it ever happened to anybody, but I had something of an autoimmune disease that I won't bore you with. It's not really important other than it probably could have been used to be an excuse for why I should not have to be in a dorm um, for all of my freshman year. And so somewhat coincidentally, I mean, I was willing to ask my parents to deploy that
Hmm.
rationale
Right.
if I needed help with this university.
Right.
And for reasons I don't remember whether it was like a junior year abroad sort of thing or something else, but for whatever reason, there was a spot that opened up in the house for second semester of my freshman year. And I was very close to the person whose roommate left was my big brother. And so, I mean, everything lined up for Hurst to basically say, would you like to move in? And my answer was, I mean, I would love to move in because I would love to get out of the room with this other guy. And so, by sophomore year, when Keith left, I mean, I was already in the house and, I mean, knew everybody by relatively short term very well because we're all sort of there all the time.
Right.
Um, so yeah, so but I mean, had never really thought. I mean, I do think that, being as small as we were relative to ZBT and how few Jewish fraternities there really were on campus, it was pretty easy to see yourself as an underdog in the fraternity community. And,
Hmm.
that I think that made it somewhat more special for us. But it was a great experience. I mean, obviously, if it wasn't a great experience, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation because you and I never would have known each other. So,
That's
um,
right. Did anybody from the fraternity help you with either your political career or your venture capitalist career?
So there are a number of brothers who became doctors. Tulane is really good at pre-med. And so yes, in the sense of there have been a number of times where they are actually specialists in sort of a relevant field to something I'm looking at and would always ask for their thoughts about it, not necessarily from a business perspective. I'm not really asking you to evaluate the CEO, but I do want to know where the science relates to what these people are doing. And, is that something that if you walked into your hospital tomorrow and heard that that's what is going to be hopefully standard of care, would that excite you, or would you say, just like everything else?
Okay, no, I was asking you if they help you as a rabbi, bringing you into the field, either your political or the venture capital
The
field.
political field, no, nobody ever had never had anything to do with anything about that was part of the fraternity. Um, I don't think I mean, part of it is my political career mostly happened during a time that they were in med school or were interns and stuff. I mean, it was before they were actual doctors that were able to sort of tell you more stuff. And so by the time I got into venture, they were out and they were practicing and we had a bunch of them that did different things. And so, I mean, there was If I needed an ophthalmologist answer, I had one thing. If I needed an oncologist answer, there was another one, and so on and so on and so on. We had lots of people who became very well thought of doctors. I think Tulane was particularly good, was and is particularly good at that anyway. I think the TEP brothers were, smarter than your average science and engineering student. Back in our day, the School of Science and Engineering was actually probably more engineering than it was science. But science was very heavily dominated by pre-meds who were doing their sort of biochem, physics, whatever stuff. Back then, the engineering part was mostly that there were a lot of oil platforms that were looking for graduates to come be part of the engineering team for the stuff that was being drilled out in the Gulf. Today, we're much more of a science end of that stuff than we are an engineering end of that stuff, partly that there's less oil out there and partly that science has become much more lucrative.
It's kind of odd that the poli sci has nothing to do with what you do, and you might have been better off with more of a science or an engineering education, but you wouldn't have gotten to where you are today if you hadn't have taken the poli sci.
I mean, I can't say that there's anything that you just said that's wrong. I think the reality is several-fold, and I really think that it's just a stars and planets aligned in a funny way. So some of it clearly relates to Gillis passing away suddenly on Inauguration Day in '85. Some of it relates to just sort of had Reagan not done what he did that caused the growth in Northern Virginia, I think at some point I would have woken up and had to figure out, like, am I staying in DC and doing something else, but sort of in public policy, or am I trying to move? Are we moving back to someplace? And I don't know where that someplace would have been.
So what you do is very interesting. If an undergraduate said, that's what I want to do, how would they, first of all, is the industry continuing to grow? And how
Yeah.
would they get into that industry?
So yes, and let me give you the yes and no answer. So the yes answer is there's nobody who even knew what the word venture capital meant until the 1970s. So, I mean, until then, it was just sort of borrowing money from somebody to do something or other,
Mm-hmm.
more or less. And it didn't really get institutionalized until kind of the mid to late 80s, is when, Kleiner Perkins and stuff were raising like Fund 3, which had never happened before to anybody. Um, as I said earlier, before that, if you were doing something institutionally, it was more likely that it was Prudential or New York Life or Merrill Lynch who had a little division inside of it that wanted to do venture, and they would be the ones you would be talking to. And back in the day when I first started, we had New York Life as a co-investor in, I don't know, 5 different deals, and Merrill in 3, and Prudential in a couple. I mean, they were what the big funds are today. I think what mostly happens in the field, which certainly over time has happened in the venture world, is that the difference between somebody like me and somebody who's running a fund is that I am truly in the venture business. If I'm getting paid by anybody, it is by the portfolio company who's giving me a board fee of some sort, but it's not, otherwise it's my money. It's not that we went and raised it. I don't get any, when I go out and help raise money, I don't get a commission on that. I'm not a broker. It's just something I do as a service to a portfolio company, because if we don't have the money, we're all going to fail. Um, and I think that, and that ecosystem has become much larger. If you, in the process of getting larger, where the differentiation lies is that if the fund people are clearly in the investing world and partly have a foot planted in the, yes, I am an investor, I'm a venture capitalist, But they're also in the fund world in the sense of if the fund doesn't do well enough for us to go out and raise fund two, then I'm out of a job. And so, you're as much in the fund business as anything else. And the fund business really kind of relies on each fund being bigger than the one that preceded it. You're still going to do the same 20 transactions over some period of time. Just the numbers get bigger. The reality is, if the numbers get to a point where we've got to invest $3 million, there are not that many companies that need $3 million tomorrow. And so the universe of what you're looking at is going to get smaller. And you just have to realize that that is a very institutional way of looking at venture capital that sits over there. The vast bulk of what happens in the world and even in this country happens over here and is really very, very different. It's a gargantuan number of angels and family offices who have some reason for wanting to give back to something that they had, or they're just excited about, the technology and whatever. They write checks that are as little as $5,000. They write checks that are as big as $20 million, but they are they're not a fund. And so my best way of giving you this as a statistic is there are 10 million businesses started in America every single year. Um, I am happy to concede that a whole boatload of those are the dry cleaners down the street and the restaurant up the block. And that's not really quite the same as what we've been talking about. On the other hand, if you look at what was done institutionally, which is anybody who has a fund, PitchBook, who's got more data on all of these kinds of things than anybody on the planet, would tell you that the biggest year in venture capital history was 2023, coming off of the rebound of COVID kind of stuff. In 2023, according to them, there were 5,204 rounds of financing that took place. Okay, so it's not the first time that somebody's gotten money. That could be your series E, F, G, H, or whatever. And of those 5,204 companies that got financed, very few of them were sort of Series A. So a lot of them have been repeats into the field. And so you can't really count them as it's a new company that got funded. It's just another company that got funded.
Mhm.
Whereas in that same year, there were 10 million businesses started in America. And somehow or another, 10 million people found enough cash to go open whatever it was they were opening. Now, maybe, they'll be out of business 3 weeks later, but nonetheless, I mean, it's just a gargantuan difference between the extent of the entrepreneurism in America and the extent of what the institutional community, who has the billions and billions and billions of dollars, actually gets financed versus how many people go out knocking on doors and saying, give me $100. Maybe not literally, but close.
Or could be family or
Yes, I mean, friends and family are
neighbors.
absolutely the first place they're going to go, for sure.
So, okay, a side question. If I'm in on the first round of financing and then there's a second round of financing, if I'm not involved in the second round of financing, my shares become diluted.
Yes and no. So yes, in the sense of there will be more shares outstanding and you will own a lesser number of them. Having said that, if we did the first round at a $10 million valuation and the next round gets done at a $30 million valuation, your shares are worth 3 times more than they were yesterday. And so are you looking at it in terms of what your percentage ownership of the company is, or are you looking at it in terms of what your shares are worth? Because in terms of what your shares are worth, you have a hell of a return compared to the stock market. If you really are worth 3 times what you were worth yesterday, on the other hand, you're not very liquid, whereas the stock market is. Um, if you're looking at it from a absolute ownership percentage, I mean, in some senses, the answer is yes. But the reality is, again, somewhat depending on field, but tech companies go back to the market multiple times. Healthcare for sure goes back to the market multiple times. For you to sort of keep your percentage is going to get harder and harder and harder as the numbers get bigger, both in terms of valuation and how much we're raising. When we have to go do a $30 million clinical trial, if you own 3% of the company, are you really going to want to write, I don't know, $1 million check? Probably not. But you might be very happy with the fact that now it's trading at a, $400 million valuation. And so your shares are that you paid $20,000 for are worth, those are decisions investors have to make.
Okay, so I don't have $1 million. I find what you do to be very interesting. Could I go to work for Prudential or New York Life and say, I'd like to work in your venture capital department? Does it work like that?
In theory, yes, there aren't very many of them that still do that. But yes, the theory, yes, you'd be more likely to be going to Kleiner Perkins or any of, a bunch of other funds who have done multiple funds and saying the same thing, but you're
Okay.
working for a company who has a management interest and a management, a fiduciary, and a capital interest in a bunch of different funds that have invested in a bunch of different companies.
So, what kind of an education would they be looking for me to have to go into that?
Um, I mean, if it was really a Kleiner Perkins, they'd be looking for a business degree from a very high profile university. I think if you were to pick some, less stable place to be employed, um, you might be able to get by with any one of a number of different credentials that are not quite that high.
But still an MBA from a
I
lesser
I
known
I
school?
I think it depends on how long you're willing to sort of be on the learning curve and how long they're willing to have you there before it's clear that you're paying dividends back to the company for your time there. I think if somebody was doing a startup fund, their very first fund, and you showed up with even a business degree out of college, let alone the MBA, and you said all the right things and you had the enthusiasm and blah 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 blah, I think they would basically figure you'll figure the rest of this out as we go along and would give you a shot.
I'm assuming that you've made a few mistakes along the way that you learned from, and you said maybe I need to investigate further before I pull the trigger on this, or any mistakes that you've learned from.
Oh, lots. I mean, I think that to some extent happens almost every day. I, I mean, I would like to say that I would like to think that I have gotten better at not making as many, but I also think the nature of startups is such that, there are no real formulas for exactly what makes any particular company work, let alone that makes every particular company work. And so, I think somewhere in there, there's in the startup world, and certainly in healthcare, there's always going to be a mix of, did we have the right technology? Did we get the right patents for it? Do we have some ability to understand how we're going to make more than one of these at a time? Do we have a clue as to how we're going to sell these and why the hospital or the nursing home or whatever is going to pay any attention to us? I mean, you can make mistakes, in all different places, and among the biggest ones will always be the chances of every hire that you go out and make being working are fundamentally zero. And so and so it's just like how big a mistake was it? How much did we screw up? How much time did we lose? And all that stuff. And so I mean, some of them are mine and some of them are other people's, but I think the whole nature of a startup is that mistakes are going to be made. And the really important thing is how quickly can you figure out that it happened? How quickly can you figure out what you think you really ought to be doing about it and get agreement to go down that path? And then were you right? Because if you messed up and just made a mistake on top of a mistake, you just have kind of compounded things, especially if you're bleeding cash and during the time that, all that's happening, which fundamentally you almost have to be because, you got some number of people on a payroll and
You ever watch Shark Tank?
I have.
How close is that to reality?
Well, I think it's probably pretty close for their reality. Um, I also have talked to some of the people who produce the show, and I think what I really have come to realize is several things. So first of all, if we're talking about how much Mark Cuban can afford to put into something, the number may sound big on TV, but relative to his net worth, I mean, it's chump change. And so when he says he's going to give 200,000 to somebody, I mean, that's fine. But the man's worth $22 billion. I mean, and that doesn't count the basketball team. And so, I mean, kind of seriously, what difference does it really make for the 20 episodes you're going to do I mean, he's going to make more in interest than he's going to lose if everything on Shark Tank went down. And that assumes that Shark Tank's not paying you, which is probably also not true. Um, I mean, I think what they're doing is they're trying to force the people who make it onto the show to be good at doing something that you need to do in any audience that you are trying to pitch your startup at, which is to do this succinctly with enthusiasm and why this is going to be the most exciting thing since sliced bread. And if you can manage to do that, people will be interested. They may have 15 questions on top of that that are going to cause them to not be interested. But you got to get past the Shark Tank side of this, which is you got 3 minutes to convince me that you actually have your hands around the next rocket ship. Um, I don't think they're trying to do a tremendous amount of due diligence on either the people or the idea. They're just trying to give you a pitch competition, and this is the reward for having won the pitch competition. Pitch competitions are run in every major city in the country constantly. I mean, the prizes may not be as big as the ones that they do on Shark Tank by a
Mhm.
lot, but Tulane now runs pitch competitions in New Orleans once a month that sort of are a 500 to a couple $1,000s to the three winners sort of thing, and audience gets to pick. So a Shark Tank like situation, but not
Mhm.
with quite as much remuneration. Um, if you're trying to get to people who are more sophisticated about their venture investments and family offices who, I mean, this is part of the family office balance sheet, but it may be that they're going to choose to concentrate on stuff that came from the kind of industry they came out of. I mean, I'm going to be biased in what I'm about to tell you, but most of the family offices I know were people who had done things that got sold to people like Boston Scientific and Medtronic. They did stuff in healthcare. They were in healthcare. And when I show up, they're looking at healthcare. And so it's all has a symmetry to it that makes sense for all of us. I know why I'm there. They know why I'm here. And hopefully we're going to working together. But, if not, I mean, I'll go on to the next place. Um, I and I think all of that differs from you showing up at a fund where I would basically tell you you should be really attentive to who it is who's having this conversation with you. Are they actually a partner? Are they just an associate? How long have they been there? How high up can you figure out they are in the food chain here? Because most of the time, those meetings are just somebody who's taken a bunch of notes. They're going to hand them in to somebody else who may or may not ever read them. And, you may or may not ever get a call back. But if you could have managed to have gotten to the right person, maybe the same story would have resonated in a different way. It's just that that day, that associate, did 8 of these and yours wasn't particularly well written. And frankly, by the time the guy who was reading them got home at 8 o'clock at night, he was tired and didn't really want to go through them anymore either. So I mean, it's a world that is very stratified, and that's the good news and the bad news because it means the good news is there's a gazillion other people out there if you can find them who might be interested in hearing your story. The bad news is most people don't have the time to go really find them, and there aren't a lot of lists. You will not walk into Nashville, Tennessee and say, "Can I please see a list of, the 2,000 people who have invested in venture deals?" I mean, first of all, it may not be music. And in which case you're wholly not out of your field, but you also, there is no list. And people who have those sorts of lists guard them like they're Fort Knox. Um, Family offices are even more secretive. And so, if you've got some way of getting into 15 or 20, you're likely to have a really good outcome. If you can't figure out how to get that done, you're going to be knocking on way more doors while you keep trying to raise money, 15, 10, $25,000 at a time.
So now I know a guy who's invented a prosthetic hand that just by wearing it, it learns and you can pick up dimes and play the piano. How do you hear about that? And how does he hear about you?
Um, that's a really good question. I mean, I can give you the most likely answer, which is that somebody he knows me, and that's how I hear about it. Um, Beyond that, if he got any press, if he went through LinkedIn and decided to follow me and then sent a note saying, I've got a prosthetic hand I'd love you to look at. I mean, that stuff has happened from time to time, but I think far less entrepreneurs do that sort of thing than you would expect. Um, in terms of how I would find them, I mean, I think if I saw an article someplace, if we had a mutual friend, if somebody did contact me through some form of social media, um, but you're now on sort of the least likely set of things that are going to result in my ending up actually making an investment because so many of them turn out to be not quite what was really described or whatever. It also, I mean, there's also only so many things I can do at any given time. I mean, if we've got, 10 relatively young companies that I'm trying to work with, all of whom have those sort of same needs, and I'm spending time with them on, I'll call it board stuff, they would call it management stuff, and trying to help in those regards. I think the fundamental reality is you could call up and my answer to you would be, that sounds really cool. I just don't have time in the next 6 weeks to do much about this. I mean, call me back maybe in a couple months, and if you're still looking or something. But realistically, I don't have the bandwidth. I mean, I don't have four other people I can turn to and say, have four other friends who are doctors who do this, that, or the other, but I don't have four other people who are, kind of really going to help work through what kind of financing are you trying to get done? How much, what valuation do you really understand why it shouldn't be that valuation, and, blah, blah, blah.
Let me ask you this. So, do you have any words of wisdom for the undergraduates who look at your career, find it incredibly interesting, and say, "That's really cool. I'd like to do that."
Well, the advice would be, first of all, graduate with, something that's going to give you a shot at being able to go do that. And obviously, as you've already articulated, give some consideration to whether you need one more degree beyond the undergraduate one to really have the best shot at some of those opportunities. I think beyond that, it's mostly just having the desire. Well, some of it will become economics, which I don't want to be wading into on anybody's behalf. But if you can afford to work for somewhat less because you don't have three kids at home and whatever it is, I mean, you probably have a much better shot of getting more offers faster than will be the case if you're really trying to get into Merrill Lynch and you're asking for a multi six-figure salary. So stuff like that I think is somewhat obvious, but maybe not to people in college and just about to graduate. And I think the last piece of advice would just be, if that's really your passion, you are you are pursuing it at a moment in time that I think like could not possibly be better for what um, you're trying to accomplish, in the sense that while things like AI are consuming a lot of money and a lot of bandwidth. The reality is this country has, first of all, I mean, in some sense, you should start with this country was built on entrepreneurism. I mean, if it wasn't for the Henry Fords and JP Morgans of, we wouldn't have trains, planes, or automobiles. So, and I don't think that's ever really changed, but I do think it has accelerated in sort of, I mean, I picked the post-World War II era, but, in reality, it really accelerated more in sort of the 50s and 60s and 70s, and then has become an actual industry in the 80s and 90s and aughts. And a much, much bigger one every one of those decades that passed. I mean, venture is really a pretty huge monetary thing. It's just the only thing that distresses me is that it just doesn't fund as many companies as you would think that that amount of money should fund. On the other hand, there are an awful lot of people out there knocking on, doors of people they've never met before and saying, "Would you please listen to my story?" who are still getting money raised that way, and or have a friend who's acting as a third party or something or other. I mean, the entrepreneurism ecosystem has become huge compared to what it was even when I was in college. I mean, and again, I'm going to say this like in regard to New Orleans, where I mean, New Orleans was absolutely an oil and gas and party town. That's the only two things that New Orleans existed for. And yet we were turning out doctors of pretty high regard. And all of them would go someplace else to practice. I mean, when I go back now and look at the people who were in school 2 years ago that I met because I was on the SSC board and are now, it's several years later, they're out of school and they're still in New Orleans. That's so completely different than the New Orleans that I existed in, where everybody ran back to their hometown or where they went to med school or something afterwards. They did not stay or return back to New Orleans. There wasn't anything for them to do there. By contrast, as an institution, not trying to bore you with sort of what the endowment numbers and all that kind of stuff are, but I'll put it in this regard. The biggest hospital in New Orleans was a place called Charity that went out of business during COVID. And so big structure, empty building that has been a blight on the landscape for a while. Tulane is in the midst of trying to acquire Charity Hospital so that they can build a Tulane hospital there. I don't know whether they're going to demolish the whole building and start all over or what, but it will also have scientific labs to do experiments and stuff in. And then are planning to move the medical school over there and have acquired 6 square blocks around Charity Hospital so that they can build a medical school complex that will, sort of hopefully rival anybody in the nation and not cause people to say, why would I go there instead of Harvard or whatever? And just the number of pitch competitions and angel stuff that's happening in conjunction with all of that it's like I'm walking into a city that's not at all like, except for the oysters, like the one that I showed up at in 1974 when it was just very, very different. And I think it's not just New Orleans. I mean, obviously that kind of stuff is happening. Yeah, I mean, I can look at what's happened to our metro area. I moved here. This was a metro area of 1.5 million people. Um, and you could get anywhere in the metro area in 20 minutes when I moved to DC. Today, we are 7.5 million metro wide. We are the seventh largest city in the country. We have a whole technology thing out in Northern Virginia that is gargantuan. I what I'm about to tell you, I can't tell you is actually true. I'm just going to tell you anyway. But sometime in the early 1990s or late 1980s, I personally believe that there were some group of Maryland legislators who stood on the Beltway at 8 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock in the afternoon and said, "Holy shit, all of these people are driving into Northern Virginia in the morning. They're all driving back out into Maryland at night. One of these days, they're all going to wake up and realize that they can pay 4% less in taxes if they just move over there. And we need to do something." And the something that they did was put a whole bunch of programs together that were meant to attract medical device and life sciences companies to the DC metropolitan area with the premise that on the one hand, this is one of the best educated cities in the country. We have great universities, we have fabulous hospitals. And on the other hand, they needed a field that was theirs. They couldn't really credibly say to anybody they were going to go steal the technology business from Northern Virginia. So, doing med devices and life sciences was a perfect answer. At the time, if you went much past Bethesda, you would have been in farmland. Today, you can go all the way out to Hagerstown, which is 40 miles up 270, and it will be medical device and life sciences company one after another, after another, after another. There is a publication called Genome something or other that publishes a daily newsletter who a couple of weeks ago had a story that was a surprise everybody. There are more life sciences companies in Washington, D.C. than any city in the country. San Francisco, San Diego, Seattle, Boston, all included. Not necessarily that everybody's an Amgen or Genentech size. I mean, our claim to fame, if there is one in life sciences, is human genome. But in sheer number, that's still a mind-boggling concept for a place that 40 years ago you couldn't have found a life science company in this town. So I'm not sure it's really answering your question, but I think, it's become big enough that if this is what you want to do, just look around because there will be some way to try to enter the sweepstakes. It may be with a company as a way to start. It may be with a financier as a way to start, but it's become a gargantuan industry.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much. This has been enlightening and educating and entertaining, and I appreciate very much you spending the time with us, and I thank you very much, and I wish you good luck on all your future ventures.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.